The fluorescent lights in conference room B buzzed with the aggressive persistence of wasps trapped in a jar. Victoria Ashworth Sterling adjusted her Hermes scarf and surveyed the assembled Riverside School District administrators with the satisfaction of a general reviewing troops before battle. The mahogany table, imported at district expense and polished to mirror perfection, reflected her carefully maintained blonde highlights as she leaned forward to address her subordinates. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had never been told no. "We have a problem, and that problem has a name: special education overspending." Principal Janet Morrison shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The woman had been running Riverside Elementary for 12 years, back when the district actually cared about serving every child. Now at 58, she found herself nodding along to budget meetings that would have horrified her younger self. "Victoria, I understand the financial pressures, but these children have legal rights under—" "Janet!" Victoria's interruption cut through the air like a scalpel. "Let me stop you right there. Legal rights, yes, but not unlimited rights. Not rights that bankrupt the district and steal resources from our high-achieving students." She stood, her Italian leather heels clicking against the polished floor as she moved to the projection screen. The numbers don't lie. The PowerPoint slide that appeared was a masterpiece of selective data presentation. Victoria had spent hours crafting charts that made special education look like a bottomless money pit, carefully omitting federal funding sources and exaggerating costs. The room fell silent except for the persistent buzz of those fluorescent lights and the scratch of pens as administrators dutifully took notes. "Autism services alone cost us $847 per student per month," Victoria continued, her manicured finger tracing the red bars on her chart. "Compare that to our gifted and talented program, which serves twice as many students for half the cost. Where's the efficiency? Where's the return on investment, Dr.?" Patricia Hayes, the district's special education coordinator, raised her hand tentatively. At 62, she had dedicated her entire career to advocating for children with disabilities. The tremor in her voice betrayed her growing desperation. "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling, with respect, you can't measure the value of special education services purely in monetary terms. These children need—" "What they need," Victoria's voice rose sharply, "is accountability. What they need is parents who stop making excuses and start taking responsibility. Half these autism diagnoses are just convenient labels for lazy parenting and undisciplined children." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Hayes's face flushed red, but she remained seated. Principal Morrison stared at her hands. The other administrators suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. They all knew what Victoria was saying was wrong, legally, ethically, morally wrong, but she held the purse strings. She held their jobs in her perfectly manicured hands. Victoria smiled, interpreting the silence as agreement rather than horror. "I'm glad we're all on the same page. Starting next quarter, we're implementing a new efficiency protocol. Special education services will be streamlined. Individualized education programs will be standardized to reduce costs. Therapy sessions will be consolidated, and these expensive one-on-one aids will be eliminating 90% of them." "You can't do that," Dr. Hayes whispered, finally finding her voice. "The federal guidelines clearly state—" "The federal guidelines," Victoria interrupted with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, "are suggestions for districts with unlimited budgets. We live in the real world, Patricia. We make tough choices. We prioritize results over feelings." What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she basked in her perceived authority, was that every word she spoke was being recorded. Not by the official district recording system, which she had conveniently disabled for this particular meeting, but by a small digital device hidden in Dr. Hayes's briefcase. The elderly coordinator had finally reached her breaking point 3 months ago and had begun documenting everything, hoping someone, somewhere, would eventually listen. What Victoria also didn't know was that her efficiency protocols violated approximately 14 different federal laws, each carrying penalties that could bankrupt not just the district, but her personally. What she definitely didn't know was that the lazy waitress who served her coffee every morning at Mel's diner had been taking careful notes of every casual conversation, every careless comment, every arrogant boast about cutting services for those kids. "Any questions?" Victoria asked, though her tone made it clear that questions were neither expected nor welcome. The room remained silent. Victoria gathered her materials with the satisfied air of someone who believed she had just solved a complex problem with simple efficiency. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door and delivered what she thought would be her closing argument. "Remember, everyone, we serve the entire community, not just the squeaky wheels, not just the problem children. We serve the students who actually contribute to our test scores, our rankings, our reputation. The rest," she shrugged eloquently, "the rest need to learn to adapt to the real world." As Victoria's heels clicked down the hallway toward her corner office, with its view of the landscaped courtyard, Dr. Hayes sat alone in conference room B, her hands shaking as she stopped the recording on her phone. 41 minutes and 17 seconds of pure, unfiltered discrimination. 41 minutes that could destroy careers and change lives. She didn't know that across town, in a cramped studio apartment above the laundromat, Sarah Chen Martinez was organizing 4 banker's boxes full of similar evidence. Sarah didn't know about Dr. Hayes's recording yet, but she would soon. Because Sarah had been building something much larger than a simple complaint or a wrongful termination lawsuit. Sarah had been building a federal case that would make national headlines and send people to prison. But first, Victoria Ashworth Sterling would need to make one crucial mistake. She would need to move from the shadows of conference rooms into the harsh light of public scrutiny. She would need to show her true colors, not just to cowering administrators, but to parents, teachers, and children who could serve as witnesses. She would need to attack a child in public. And in 3 days, at the annual Spring Carnival, she would get her chance when a 7-year-old girl with autism would have a meltdown near the dunking booth, and her mother, a tired-looking waitress in a stained uniform, would step forward to protect her daughter. That would be the moment when Victoria Ashworth Sterling's carefully constructed world would begin its spectacular collapse. That would be the moment when malicious compliance would reveal its true power. For now, though, Victoria sat in her office, reviewing budget projections and congratulating herself on her business acumen. She poured herself a cup of coffee from her personal espresso machine, paid for with special education funds, and smiled at her reflection in the window. She had no idea she was about to go to war with someone who had been preparing for this battle for over 2 years, someone who never lost. Sarah Chen Martinez's alarm buzzed at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before she actually needed to get up. She had learned years ago that those stolen moments of consciousness before the day officially began were precious, a small pocket of time where she could remember who she really was, before putting on her carefully constructed mask of exhaustion and defeat. In the darkness of her studio apartment, surrounded by law books hidden behind mismatched curtains and evidence boxes disguised as storage containers, Sarah allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to be the woman she used to be. The woman who had graduated summa cum laude from Stanford Law. The woman who had won her first disability rights case at 26. The woman who had been profiled in Legal Weekly as the advocate's advocate before Maya was born, and everything changed. At 4:50 a.m., she became someone else entirely. The transformation was meticulous. Sarah pulled her hair back into a messy ponytail, applied just enough concealer to look tired but not sick, and slipped into the polyester uniform that smelled permanently of bacon grease and broken dreams. She practiced her slouch in the bathroom mirror, letting her shoulders curve forward in defeat, allowing her brilliant mind to hide behind the mask of someone life had beaten down. The drive to Mel's diner took 12 minutes through the pre-dawn streets of Riverside. Sarah had timed it precisely, just as she had timed every aspect of her double life. She arrived at 5:15 a.m., unlocked the door with keys that belonged to Sarah Martinez. No chen, no hyphen, no hint of the law degree or the trust fund or the carefully constructed legal trap that was about to spring shut. "Morning, hun," called out Big Jim from behind the grill. At 63, he had been flipping eggs at Mel's longer than Sarah had been alive. He was also one of the few people in Riverside who treated her with genuine kindness, never asking too many questions about why a woman with her obvious intelligence was content to pour coffee for minimum wage plus tips. "Morning, Jim," Sarah replied, tying her apron and checking the coffee urns. The routine was comfortable now, after 18 months of practice. Fill the sugar dispensers, check the cream, count the register, prepare for the morning rush of construction workers, teachers, and school administrators who had no idea they were being studied like specimens under a microscope. At 6:23 a.m., the bell above the door chimed, and Victoria Ashworth Sterling swept in with her usual air of entitled urgency. Sarah's pulse quickened slightly, not with nervousness, but with the anticipation of a hunter who had been tracking prey for months and finally had it in range. "The usual?" Sarah asked, already reaching for the largest to-go cup and the expensive Colombian blend that Victoria insisted on, even though she never tipped more than 50 cents. "Make it strong," Victoria commanded, not bothering to look up from her phone. "I have a school board meeting this morning, and I need to stay sharp. We're discussing some necessary budget adjustments." Sarah's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second as she poured the coffee. Budget adjustments. She knew exactly what that meant. Victoria was planning to announce the special education cuts today, the cuts that would directly impact Maya and 17 other children in the district, the cuts that were about to become Exhibit A in a federal lawsuit. "Anything else?" Sarah asked, her voice perfectly calibrated to sound disinterested. Victoria finally looked up, her gaze sliding over Sarah with the dismissive assessment of someone cataloguing furniture. "Actually, yes. Do you have children in the district?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In 18 months of serving Victoria coffee, they had never moved beyond transactional pleasantries. Yes, my daughter goes to Riverside Elementary." Victoria's expression shifted to something resembling concern, though Sarah recognized it as the performance of empathy rather than the genuine article. "You might want to pay attention to what's happening with the school board. We're making some important changes. Efficiency improvements. Your daughter will benefit from our focus on academic excellence." Sarah nodded slowly, playing her part perfectly. "That sounds good. I just want what's best for Maya." "Maya," Victoria repeated, and something flickered across her face. "Unusual name. Is she in special classes?" The question landed like a physical blow, but Sarah's expression remained neutral. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Victoria was fishing, trying to identify which parents might cause problems when the cuts were announced. She gets some extra help sometimes, reading and stuff. Victoria's smile turned sharp. "Well, I hope she's not too dependent on those services. Children need to learn resilience, not rely on accommodations as crutches. The real world doesn't make special exceptions." Sarah poured cream into Victoria's coffee with steady hands, though inside she was cataloguing every word for the legal brief that was already half-written in her mind. Discrimination, targeting, intent to harm. Each statement was another nail in Victoria's professional coffin. "That'll be $4.50, Sarah said. Victoria dropped a $5 bill on the counter and walked out without waiting for change, already absorbed in her phone again. Sarah watched through the window as Victoria climbed into her BMW SUV, paid for with the salary from a job funded by taxpayers, many of whom earned less in a week than Victoria spent on her monthly manicures. As soon as Victoria's car disappeared around the corner, Sarah moved with purpose. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick text to Marcus Thompson. She took the bait, confirmed the announcement is today, recording everything. Marcus's response came immediately. Perfect. I'm already in position at the school. Camera feeds are live. Dr. Hayes has agreed to testify. Sarah smiled as she deleted the text conversation. Dr. Hayes, the special education coordinator who had been documenting Victoria's discriminatory statements for months. Sarah had approached her carefully, gradually, building trust over shared coffee breaks and carefully casual conversations about the challenges facing special needs students. It had taken 6 months before Dr. Hayes finally broke down and admitted she had been recording meetings, terrified for the children under her care, but too afraid for her job to speak up alone. That's when Sarah had revealed her true identity and explained the larger plan. The next text was to her former law partner, now running the disability rights clinic at Stanford. Initiate Phase 2. We have enough evidence for the preliminary injunction. The trust fund provisions can be triggered as of today's board meeting. Sarah's phone buzzed with an immediate response. Holy shit, Sarah. Are you sure about this? Once we file, there's no going back. This will be national news. Sarah looked around Mel's diner, at the cracked vinyl booths, the flickering neon sign, the lingering smell of industrial coffee, and decades of broken dreams. She thought about Maya, currently sitting in Mrs. Peterson's second-grade class, probably stimming quietly with the stress ball Sarah had packed in her backpack. Maya, who was brilliant and funny and kind, but who needed accommodations to access her education. Maya, who would be denied those accommodations if Victoria's plan succeeded. I'm sure, she typed back. File the papers, today. The morning rush continued around her as Sarah served coffee to construction workers and teachers, her movements automatic while her mind calculated legal strategies and federal penalties. Victoria had no idea that her casual cruelty had just triggered a cascade of consequences that would destroy everything she had worked to build. At 11:30 a.m., Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Board meeting started early. Victoria just announced the cuts. Dr. Hayes is getting it all on record. Several parents are here. They look furious. Sarah checked the time. Her shift ended at 2 p.m., but she could probably leave early if she claimed Maya was sick. She needed to be at that school board meeting, not as Sarah Chen Martinez, attorney and trust fund beneficiary, but as Sarah Martinez, concerned parent and minimum wage worker. She needed to be in the audience when Victoria made her next crucial mistake. Because Victoria would make another mistake. Arrogant people always did. They couldn't help themselves. Sarah untied her apron and approached Big Jim at the grill. Jim, I'm sorry, but I need to leave early. Maya's school called. She's not feeling well. Jim looked up from the burger he was flipping, his weathered face creased with concern. Go on, hon. Kid comes first. I can handle the lunch crowd. Sarah grabbed her purse and headed for the door, pausing only to check her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser. Perfect. She looked exactly like what Victoria expected to see. A struggling single mother, overwhelmed and outmatched, desperate to protect her child, but lacking the resources to fight back effectively. Victoria was about to learn that appearances could be very, very deceiving. As Sarah drove toward Riverside Elementary, she allowed herself a moment of cold satisfaction. Every element was in place. Every piece of evidence had been gathered. Every legal precedent had been researched and cited. The trust fund, established by her grandmother with the specific purpose of protecting children like Maya, was ready to unleash its full power. Victoria Ashworth Sterling had spent months systematically targeting the most vulnerable children in the district. In approximately 3 hours, she was about to discover that one of those children had the most powerful legal protection in the state. The trap had been set for over a year. Today, it would finally spring shut. What caught your attention the most in this story so far? Was it Victoria's casual cruelty towards special needs children, or Sarah's incredible patience in building her case? Drop a comment below and let me know which moment made your blood boil the most. I read every single response. The Riverside Elementary School auditorium hadn't seen this many parents since the infamous asbestos scare of 2019. By 2:45 p.m., every folding chair was occupied. and late arrivals lined the walls with the grim determination of people who knew they were about to witness something terrible but felt powerless to stop it. Sarah slipped in through the back entrance, her waitress uniform still smelling of coffee and bacon. She had deliberately arrived 15 minutes late, knowing that Victoria would already be in full performance mode, drunk on her own authority and the sound of her own voice. Sarah found a spot against the wall next to Tom Morrison, a truck driver whose son Danny had Down syndrome and received speech therapy 3 times a week. "Did I miss anything?" Sarah whispered, playing her role perfectly. Tom's face was flushed with anger. "She's been talking for 20 minutes about fiscal responsibility and tough choices. Haven't mentioned the kids once. It's all numbers and charts." Sarah nodded sympathetically, while her trained legal mind catalogued everything she observed. Victoria stood at the podium in a designer blazer that cost more than most of these parents made in a month, gesturing at a PowerPoint presentation that reduced children's lives to statistical data points. Behind her, the other board members sat in uncomfortable silence, complicit through their cowardice. "The reality," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the condescending tone of someone explaining simple concepts to simple people, "is that we can no longer afford to provide premium services to a small percentage of students, while the majority suffer from overcrowded classrooms and outdated textbooks." Sarah's phone vibrated, a text from Marcus, somewhere in the room with a hidden camera. She just said, "Special ed kids are resource drains, getting everything." These individualized programs," Victoria continued, "while well-intentioned, have become a luxury we simply cannot sustain. Starting next month, we will be implementing a streamlined approach that serves more children more efficiently." Elena Rodriguez, whose daughter had autism, stood up abruptly. "What does streamlined mean exactly? My Isabella needs one-on-one support to—" "Ma'am," Victoria interrupted with a plastic smile, "please save questions for the designated Q&A period. As I was saying, efficiency doesn't mean reduction in quality. It means elimination of redundancy and dependency." Sarah watched Elena sink back into her chair, defeated by the simple application of procedural authority. This was Victoria's specialty, using rules and regulations as weapons against people who didn't know how to fight back. Sarah had seen it countless times in her legal career. Bullies hiding behind bureaucracy, using complexity as a shield for cruelty. But Sarah knew something Victoria didn't. She knew that every word being spoken was being recorded not just by Marcus's hidden equipment, but by the district's own official recording system, the same system Victoria thought she had disabled. Dr. Hayes had quietly reactivated it 20 minutes before the meeting began, ensuring that every discriminatory statement would be preserved in the official record. Victoria clicked to her next slide, a pie chart showing special education costs in alarming red. These numbers speak for themselves. 23% of our budget goes to serve less than 8% of our students. From a business perspective, this is unsustainable. "These aren't business transactions," called out Maria Santos, whose son had cerebral palsy. "These are our children." Victoria's smile tightened. "Mrs. Santos, I understand emotions are running high, but we must make decisions based on facts, not feelings. Your son will still receive services. They'll simply be more appropriate to his actual needs." The phrase hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah recognized it immediately from her years of fighting discrimination cases. Appropriate to his actual needs was code for, "We've decided your child doesn't deserve what they're currently getting." "What does that mean?" Maria pressed, standing now. "Miguel needs his physical therapist. He needs his communication device. Are you taking those away?" "We are not taking anything away," Victoria replied, though her tone suggested she was losing patience with the interruption. "We're right-sizing services to match capabilities. Some children have been over-accommodated. It doesn't serve them well in the long run." Sarah felt her jaw clench. Over-accommodated. The legal implications of that statement alone could fund a dozen lawsuits. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick note to herself, though she knew every word was already burned into her photographic memory. The murmur of angry voices grew louder as parents began to realize what they were hearing. Victoria raised her hand for silence, her composure beginning to crack under the pressure of actual resistance. Ladies and gentlemen, please, these decisions have been made after careful consideration by qualified professionals. We understand change is difficult, but progress requires difficult choices. Qualified professionals? Dr. Hayes's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The special education coordinator had remained silent until now, but something in Victoria's tone had finally pushed her past her breaking point. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling, with respect, what are your qualifications for determining the educational needs of children with disabilities? Victoria's smile disappeared entirely. This wasn't part of her carefully scripted presentation. Dr. Hayes, I believe we've discussed the importance of presenting a united front to the community. I'm asking about your qualifications, Dr. Hayes pressed, her voice steady despite the obvious risk to her career. Do you have training in special education? Experience working with disabled children? Any background that would give you expertise in this area? The auditorium fell silent. Parents leaned forward. Even the board members looked uncomfortable. Sarah recognized this moment. It was what trial lawyers called the crack in the wall, the moment when careful preparation met spontaneous courage and everything changed. Victoria's face flushed red. My qualifications are fiscal responsibility and common sense, something that seems to be in short supply when it comes to these special programs. These special programs, Dr. Hayes said quietly, are required by federal law. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act mandates. The federal government, Victoria snapped, doesn't have to balance our budget or answer to our taxpayers. We do, and I'll be damned if I'm going to apologize for putting the needs of normal children first. The words echoed in the sudden silence. Normal children. Sarah felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. Victoria had just crossed the line from bureaucratic cruelty into open discrimination, and she had done it in front of 50 witnesses with recording devices running. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of parents who had just been told their children weren't normal, at Maria Santos, tears streaming down her cheeks, at Eleanor Rodriguez, clutching her purse like a shield, at Tom Morrison, whose hands were clenched into fists. Then she looked at Victoria, standing at the podium with her designer clothes and her contemptuous smile, completely unaware that she had just provided the key evidence for her own destruction. "Excuse me," Sarah said, raising her hand. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, perfectly calibrated to sound like what Victoria expected from a waitress who had worked a double shift. Victoria looked in her direction with barely concealed annoyance. "Yes? I'm sorry. I don't understand something," Sarah continued, her tone apologetic and confused. "You said normal children. Does that mean my daughter Maya isn't normal?" The question was delivered with perfect innocence, but Sarah could see Victoria's political instincts warring with her arrogance. The smart play would be to backtrack, to clarify, to apologize. But Victoria had never been told no in her entire privileged life, and she was surrounded by what she perceived as her inferiors. "What I mean," Victoria said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "is that some children can succeed in a regular classroom environment without expensive accommodations, while others require additional support." "So the children who need additional support aren't normal," Sarah pressed, her voice still quiet and confused. "They're different," Victoria said, the irritation creeping into her voice now. "They have special needs that—" "My Maya has autism," Sarah interrupted softly. "Are you saying she's not normal because she's autistic?" The trap was springing shut, and Victoria was too arrogant to see it. Around the room, other parents were pulling out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Marcus would be getting everything, but now they'd have multiple angles, multiple recordings. "Look!" Victoria said, her composure finally cracking entirely. Some children have developmental issues that require expensive interventions. Those interventions take resources away from children who can actually benefit from standard education. It's simple mathematics. So, autistic children can't benefit from education? Sarah asked, her voice still maddeningly calm. That's not what I said, Victoria snapped, but we have to be realistic about outcomes and return on investment. Some children will never... She caught herself, but it was too late. Never what? Sarah pressed. Victoria's face was red now, her carefully constructed political mask completely gone. Never achieve the same academic standards as typical children. We can't pretend otherwise just to make parents feel better about their children's limitations. The auditorium erupted. Parents were shouting, recording, demanding answers. Board members were frantically whispering to each other. Dr. Hayes was writing furiously in her notebook. Sarah stood up slowly, her hand still raised. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling, she called out, her voice somehow carrying over the chaos. I have one more question. Victoria, perhaps sensing that she had gone too far, tried to regain control. I think we've had enough questions for today. If parents have specific concerns, they can schedule appointments with their children's teachers. Actually, Sarah said, her voice growing slightly stronger, under the Open Meetings Act, you're required to allow public comment. And I believe I have the right to ask about the legal basis for these policy changes. Something flickered across Victoria's face, surprised that the waitress knew about the Open Meetings Act, but she was too far down the path of arrogance to turn back now. Fine, Victoria said through gritted teeth. One more question. Sarah smiled, not the defeated smile of an overwhelmed single mother, but something cooler and more dangerous. I'm wondering if you've consulted with legal counsel about the federal compliance issues related to reducing special education services, because it seems like these changes might violate several federal statutes. The room went quiet again. Victoria stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, a growing suspicion dawning in her eyes. I'm sorry, Victoria said slowly, but who are you exactly? Sarah's smile widened. I'm Maya Martinez's mother. I work at Mel's Diner. I serve you coffee every morning. She paused, letting that sink in. And I have some concerns about the legal implications of what you're proposing. Victoria's face went white. She was beginning to realize that this wasn't going according to script, that the quiet waitress who had been asking innocent questions might not be as innocent as she seemed. But it was too late. The words had been spoken. The recordings had been made. The federal laws had been violated in front of 50 witnesses. The trap had been sprung, and Victoria Ashworth Sterling was about to discover that underestimating people was a very expensive mistake. If you're enjoying this story of justice being served, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We post new stories of accountability and consequences every week, and stick around, because you won't believe what happens when the authorities arrive. The call to the State Department of Education came at 3:47 p.m., exactly 6 minutes after Victoria Ashworth Sterling declared the meeting adjourned and fled from the auditorium. Dr. Patricia Hayes made it from her office phone, her hands trembling as she dialed the emergency compliance hotline that she had hoped never to use in her 40-year career. Civil Rights Division. This is Director Catherine Walsh speaking. Dr. Hayes took a shaky breath. Director Walsh, this is Dr. Patricia Hayes, Special Education Coordinator for Riverside School District. I need to report immediate federal compliance violations and discrimination against students with disabilities. The line went quiet for a moment. Director Walsh had handled thousands of these calls, but something in Dr. Hayes's voice, a mixture of terror and determination, caught her attention. Dr. Hayes, what's the nature of the violations? A school board president just announced cuts to special education services in direct violation of federal law, and when questioned by parents, she stated that autistic children would never achieve the same academic standards as typical children, and referred to their needs as limitations. All of this was recorded and witnessed by approximately 50 community members. Another pause. Dr. Hayes, are you saying a school board president made discriminatory statements about disabled children in a public meeting? Yes, ma'am. And that's not the worst part. Dr. Hayes's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I have evidence that she's been systematically targeting special education programs for cuts while diverting funds to programs that benefit her own daughter. I've been documenting everything for months. Director Walsh was already reaching for her emergency response protocols. Dr. Hayes, I'm initiating an immediate federal investigation. Don't discuss this with anyone in your district leadership until our team arrives. Can you secure any recordings or documents? They're already secured. And Director Walsh, you should know that one of the parents at that meeting seemed to know an awful lot about federal education law. I think there might be more to this story than meets the eye. 43 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into the Riverside School District parking lot, followed closely by a white van with U.S. Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, emblazoned on its side. Director Catherine Walsh stepped out of the SUV with the purposeful stride of someone who had ended careers with her investigations. At 56, she had 27 years of experience exposing discrimination in schools, and she could smell a federal violation from 3 states away. Behind her emerged Agent David Chen, no relation to Sarah, though the coincidence would later strike everyone as poetic justice, a forensic accountant whose specialty was tracking misappropriated education funds. His briefcase contained enough legal authority to freeze every account the district controlled. Victoria was in her office, door locked, desperately making phone calls when her secretary knocked. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling, there are federal investigators here to see you. They say it's urgent. Victoria's blood turned to ice water. Federal investigators? Impossible. She had been careful, hadn't she? The fund transfers were complex, buried in legitimate budget line items. No one could have tracked them without access to the internal accounting system. Federal investigators from where? Victoria called through the door, buying time while she quickly closed the spreadsheet on her computer screen. The Department of Education. They're asking about today's board meeting and something about civil rights violations. Victoria's mind raced. The board meeting had gone badly, yes, but surely that was a personnel matter, not a federal case. She took a deep breath, straightened her blazer, and opened the door with her most authoritative smile. "Gentlemen," she said as she approached the reception area, "I'm Victoria Ashworth Sterling, President of the Riverside School Board. I understand you have some questions?" Director Walsh looked up from the notepad where she had been writing preliminary observations about the district's administrative wing, noting the expensive artwork, the premium coffee machine, the general air of an organization spending money on appearances while cutting services for children. "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling, I'm Director Catherine Walsh, Office for Civil Rights. This is Agent David Chen, Federal Education Compliance Division. We need to discuss some serious allegations regarding discrimination against students with disabilities." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean. We've had some necessary budget discussions, but nothing discriminatory. We serve all students equally." "Ma'am," Agent Chen stepped forward, pulling out a digital recorder. "We have multiple recordings of statements you made in today's public meeting. Would you like us to play them back? Or would you prefer to tell us in your own words why you believe autistic children will never achieve the same academic standards as typical children?" The blood drained from Victoria's face. They had recordings, multiple recordings, which meant multiple people had been documenting everything, which meant this wasn't some spontaneous complaint, but a coordinated response to her statements. "I think there may have been some misunderstanding," Victoria said carefully, her political training finally kicking in. "In the heat of budget discussions, sometimes language can be imprecise. What I meant was..." "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling," Director Walsh interrupted, "we're also investigating allegations of financial impropriety related to special education funds. Agent Chen will need access to all budget documents, expenditure reports, and account transfers for the past 18 months. Victoria felt the walls closing in. Financial impropriety. They knew about the money. But how? The transfers had been carefully disguised as legitimate administrative costs. Unless someone with accounting expertise had been tracking every transaction, there was no way to... The realization hit her like a physical blow. The waitress, the quiet woman who served her coffee every morning and who had somehow known about federal education law, the woman who had asked exactly the right questions to elicit the most damaging responses, the woman who had been watching, listening, recording for months. "I want to speak with my lawyer," Victoria said quietly. "That's your right," Director Walsh replied. "But first, we need to secure all relevant documents and interview key personnel. Dr. Hayes has agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation." Victoria's knees nearly buckled. Dr. Hayes, the woman who had challenged her in the meeting, who had been documenting everything, who had probably been feeding information to outside sources for months. Victoria had underestimated her completely, dismissed her as a weak old woman afraid for her job. "I also need to inform you," Agent Chen continued, opening his briefcase and removing an official-looking document, "that as of 4:30 p.m. today, all district financial accounts have been frozen pending completion of our investigation. Additionally, the State Attorney General's office has been notified of potential criminal violations of federal education law." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Frozen accounts. Criminal violations. State Attorney General. This wasn't a simple compliance review. This was a full-scale federal investigation that could end in criminal charges. "Furthermore," Director Walsh added, pulling out her own documentation, "we've received a formal complaint filed under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The complaint alleges systematic discrimination against students with disabilities and includes detailed evidence of policy violations dating back 18 months. Victoria tried to speak, but found her voice had disappeared entirely. An ADA complaint with 18 months of evidence meant someone had been building a case against her for over a year, someone with legal expertise and unlimited patience. Someone who had been watching her every move while she remained completely oblivious to the danger. "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling," Director Walsh continued, "I'm required to inform you that falsifying statements to federal investigators is a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison and $250,000 in fines. With that in mind, would you like to revise any of the statements you made at today's board meeting?" Victoria looked around the administrative wing that had been her kingdom for the past year, the expensive renovations she had authorized, the premium coffee machine she had purchased with discretionary funds, the artwork that had been bought while cutting therapy services for disabled children. Everything that had seemed like evidence of her success now looked like evidence of her crimes. I need to call my husband," Victoria whispered. "You can make that call from the conference room," Agent Chen said, gesturing toward the same room where Victoria had announced her discriminatory policies just that morning. "We'll need to conduct formal interviews with all administrative staff, starting with you." As Victoria walked toward the conference room on unsteady legs, she passed Dr. Hayes' office. Through the open door, she could see the elderly woman sitting calmly at her desk, speaking quietly into her phone. On the desk were 4 boxes of documents, neatly labeled and organized, clearly prepared for this moment. Dr. Hayes looked up and met Victoria's eyes. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at Victoria's downfall, only the quiet sadness of someone who had watched a preventable tragedy unfold and finally found the courage to stop it. "Dr. Hayes," Director Walsh called out, "we're ready for your statement whenever you are." "Coming, Director," Dr. Hayes replied, standing with the dignity of someone who had finally done the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. Victoria continued toward the conference room, her Hermes heels clicking against the polished floor with none of their usual authority. Behind her, she could hear Agent Chen setting up recording equipment and Director Walsh making calls to coordinate with other federal agencies. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. The local news van pulled into the parking lot, followed by cars carrying parents who had been at the morning meeting and were now returning with their own recording devices and prepared statements. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "Just saw the news. Get a lawyer now." The news. It was already on the news. Victoria looked out the window of the conference room and saw a reporter setting up for a live broadcast, the Riverside Elementary sign clearly visible behind her. Her public humiliation was about to begin, but that was nothing compared to what was coming next, because while Victoria had been focused on federal investigators and news cameras, she had missed the most important arrival of all. At 5:23 p.m., a modest Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot. Sarah Chen Martinez stepped out, no longer wearing her waitress uniform. Instead, she wore a tailored business suit and carried a briefcase that contained the legal documentation to destroy everything Victoria had built. The real confrontation was about to begin. Sarah Chen Martinez walked through the front doors of Riverside Elementary at 5:31 p.m. with the measured pace of someone who owned the battlefield. Gone was the tired waitress with the defeated posture and the stained uniform. In her place stood a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, her long black hair pulled back in a professional chignon, carrying a briefcase that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The transformation was so complete that the security guard didn't recognize her until she was already past the reception desk. "Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am," he called out. "School's closed. You need to check in at—" Sarah turned and smiled, extending a business card with the fluid motion of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Sarah Chen Martinez, attorney at law, representing the Chen family trust in the matter of discriminatory practices under federal education law. "I believe Director Walsh is expecting me." The security guard stared at the card as if it were written in hieroglyphics. This was the waitress from Mel's Diner. This was the quiet woman who brought her daughter to school pickup in a beat-up Honda. This was an attorney. I'll call Director Walsh," he stammered. "Thank you," Sarah replied pleasantly, checking her watch. "Tell her the trust fund attorney has arrived with the supplemental evidence package." Sarah stood in the lobby, surrounded by construction paper art projects and motivational posters about kindness, while her mind catalogued every detail that would soon become part of a federal court record. The smell of industrial disinfectant, the scuffed linoleum floors, the outdated textbooks visible through classroom windows, all evidence of a district that spent money on administrative luxuries while children learned in substandard conditions. Director Walsh appeared within minutes, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to sharp interest as she took in Sarah's transformation. "Ms. Chen Martinez," Director Walsh said, extending her hand. "I understand you were present at this morning's board meeting?" "I was," Sarah replied, accepting the handshake with a grip that conveyed quiet confidence. "Though I should clarify my role here. I'm not just a concerned parent. I'm the legal representative for the Evelyn Chen Memorial Trust for Disability Advocacy, and I've been conducting a comprehensive investigation of this district's practices for the past 18 months. Director Walsh's eyebrows rose. The Chen Trust was legendary in disability rights circles, a $50 million fund established specifically to pursue federal litigation against discriminatory institutions. If they were involved, this wasn't just a routine compliance issue. 18 months, Director Walsh repeated carefully, and you've been gathering evidence all this time. Sarah's smile was razor-sharp. Every conversation, every policy decision, every illegal fund transfer. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling has been very forthcoming in her communications, particularly during our morning coffee chats at Mel's Diner. The implications hit Director Walsh immediately. This hadn't been a spontaneous complaint triggered by today's meeting. This had been a carefully orchestrated investigation conducted by someone with the resources and expertise to build an airtight federal case. Agent Chen, Director Walsh called to her colleague who was photographing financial documents in the administrative office. "I think you need to hear this." Agent Chen appeared, still wearing latex gloves and carrying a box of budget reports. His expression sharpened when he saw Sarah's professional attire and the briefcase that clearly contained serious legal documentation. "Agent Chen, this is attorney Sarah Chen Martinez, representing the Chen Family Trust. She's been conducting an independent investigation of the district." Agent Chen set down his box of evidence. "Ms. Chen Martinez, what kind of investigation are we talking about?" Sarah placed her briefcase on the reception desk and opened it with the precise movements of a surgeon. Inside were organized sections containing hundreds of documents, each tagged with color-coded labels and cross-referenced with federal statute numbers. A comprehensive documentation of systematic discrimination against students with disabilities, illegal diversion of federal funds, and conspiracy to deprive children of their civil rights under federal law, Sarah said, removing the first binder. "This contains recordings of 47 separate conversations with Mrs. Ashworth Sterling in which she expressed discriminatory intent, detailed financial records showing misappropriation of special education funds, and correspondence proving her intent to circumvent federal accommodation requirements." Agent Chen's eyes widened as he flipped through the meticulously organized evidence. "You recorded 47 conversations? Washington is a one-party consent state," Sarah replied smoothly. "As long as one party to a conversation consents to recording, it's admissible in court. I consented to all 47 recordings." Director Walsh was studying the financial documents, her expression growing darker with each page. "These show fund transfers from special education accounts to," she looked up sharply, "to accounts used to pay tuition at Riverside Preparatory Academy?" "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling's daughter's private school," Sarah confirmed. "Approximately $73,000 in illegal transfers over 14 months. Money that was supposed to provide therapy services for autistic children instead paid for her daughter's elite education." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Victoria's voice carrying from the conference room down the hall, where she was apparently arguing with someone on the phone about legal representation. "She doesn't know yet, does she?" Agent Chen asked quietly. "She doesn't know who you really are." Sarah's smile was winter cold. "She knows I'm Maya's mother. She knows I work at Mel's Diner. She has no idea that I graduated summa cum laude from Stanford Law School, that I've won 43 federal discrimination cases, or that my grandmother left $50 million specifically to destroy people like her." Director Walsh was still processing the evidence. "Ms. Chen Martinez, this level of documentation, this represents thousands of hours of investigation. Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "Because I needed her to hang herself with her own rope," Sarah replied simply. "Every discriminatory statement, every illegal fund transfer, every cruel policy decision had to be fully documented and corroborated. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling had to demonstrate a clear pattern of intentional discrimination. Today's meeting was simply the final piece of evidence I needed." Sarah removed another binder from her briefcase. "This contains statements from 17 different families whose children were denied services, medical evaluations proving those denials were medically inappropriate, and documentation showing that the denial decisions were made for budgetary rather than educational reasons." Agent Chen was taking notes furiously. "And you collected all of this while working undercover?" "The best investigations happen when the subject doesn't know they're being investigated," Sarah replied. "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling thought she was talking to a powerless single mother. She felt safe expressing her true beliefs about disabled children because she assumed I had no recourse." Director Walsh closed the financial binder and looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. "Ms. Chen Martinez, in 30 years of investigating education discrimination, I've never seen a case this thoroughly documented. This isn't just a compliance violation, this is conspiracy and embezzlement. Which is why the State Attorney General will be filing criminal charges tomorrow morning, Sarah said matter-of-factly. The trust fund has retained the law firm of Morrison, Beck and Associates to handle the criminal referrals. Morrison, Beck and Associates. Agent Chen recognized the name immediately. They were the firm that had successfully prosecuted 3 governors and a dozen federal officials for corruption. If they were involved, Victoria Ashworth Sterling's problems had just moved from administrative to criminal. There's something else, Sarah continued, removing a final document from her briefcase. This morning, Mrs. Ashworth Sterling asked me directly if my daughter was in special classes and proceeded to make discriminatory statements about Maya's autism. She targeted my child specifically because of her disability status. Director Walsh's expression hardened. Personal targeting of a specific disabled child. That's a separate federal violation with enhanced penalties. Exactly. And since Maya is the primary beneficiary of the Chen Trust, the targeting of my daughter triggers the Trust's maximum enforcement provisions. Sarah's smile was absolutely predatory now. Unlimited legal funding until every perpetrator is prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced someone's approach. Victoria Ashworth Sterling appeared, flanked by a man in an expensive suit who was clearly her hastily retained attorney. Victoria's face was pale and drawn, her earlier arrogance completely evaporated. She stopped short when she saw Sarah standing at the reception desk in full legal attire, surrounded by federal investigators and boxes of evidence. "You!" Victoria whispered, the color draining completely from her face. "You're the waitress. You're Maya's mother. I'm attorney Sarah Chen Martinez," Sarah replied calmly. "And I've been building a federal case against you for 18 months. Every conversation we've had, every cruel comment you've made about disabled children, every illegal fund transfer you've authorized, all of it has been documented and will be presented as evidence in federal court." Victoria swayed on her feet. Her attorney grabbed her arm to steady her while frantically flipping through his legal pad, trying to understand what his client had walked into. "This is impossible," Victoria breathed. "You work at a diner. You drive a beat-up car. You live in that apartment above the laundromat. You can't be—" "I work at the diner to gather evidence," Sarah replied evenly. "I drive an ordinary car to maintain my cover. I live in that apartment to understand exactly what you think of people you consider beneath you. Everything you've seen for the past year and a half has been carefully constructed to get you to reveal your true nature." Victoria's attorney finally found his voice. "Ms. Chen Martinez, if you're representing opposing interests, you should have disclosed your identity to my client." "Actually," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court, "I had no duty to disclose anything. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling was speaking as a public official in her capacity as school board president. Every statement she made was fair game for documentation." She turned back to Victoria, who was now leaning heavily against the wall for support. Moreover, under the Civil Rights Act of 1968, conducting surveillance of public officials suspected of civil rights violations is not only legal, it's encouraged. The Department of Justice has specific provisions for exactly this type of investigation. Director Walsh was watching this exchange with fascination. "Ms. Chen Martinez, for the record, you're stating that you conducted an 18-month undercover investigation that resulted in documentation of federal crimes. That's correct. And in approximately, Sarah checked her watch, 12 minutes, representatives from the FBI's white-collar crime division will arrive to take Mrs. Ashworth Sterling into custody on federal embezzlement charges." Victoria's attorney went white. "Federal embezzlement charges." Sarah nodded toward Agent Chen, who was holding up one of the financial documents. $73,000 in federal special education funds illegally diverted to pay private school tuition. That's a federal crime punishable by up to 20 years in prison. Victoria finally found her voice. though it came out as a strangled whisper. "This isn't possible. I was careful. I was smart about it. No one could have tracked. No one except a Stanford-trained attorney with a photographic memory and unlimited financial resources," Sarah finished. "Someone who spent 18 months documenting every transaction, every conversation, every cruel decision you made." Victoria slumped against the wall, the full scope of her situation finally becoming clear. She wasn't just facing administrative discipline or public embarrassment. She was facing federal criminal charges that could send her to prison for decades. "Why?" Victoria asked weakly. "Why go to all this trouble? Why not just file a complaint?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, and for a moment the fierce advocate was replaced by the protective mother. "Because you called my daughter weird," she said quietly. "Because you laughed about cutting services for those autism kids. Because you used your position of power to hurt vulnerable children and their families. Because someone had to stop you." Sarah closed her briefcase with a decisive click. "And because my grandmother always taught me that bullies only understand one language: consequences." The sound of sirens in the distance announced that Victoria Ashworth Sterling's consequences were about to arrive. The FBI arrived at exactly 5:47 p.m. in 3 black SUVs that moved with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Special Agent Rebecca Morrison stepped out of the lead vehicle carrying an arrest warrant, a search warrant, and the grim satisfaction of someone who had spent her entire career putting white-collar criminals behind bars. Victoria Ashworth Sterling watched through the lobby windows as federal agents emerged from their vehicles like dark-suited harbingers of her destruction. Her legs gave out completely, and she sank into one of the plastic chairs meant for visiting parents, her designer blazer wrinkled and her carefully styled hair beginning to fall from its pins. "This can't be happening," Victoria whispered to her attorney, Thomas Hartwell, who was frantically scrolling through his phone, trying to contact federal defense specialists. "It's just a school board position. It's supposed to be about budget meetings and curriculum approval. People don't go to federal prison for school board decisions." Sarah Chen Martinez overheard the comment and almost laughed at the profound ignorance it revealed. Almost. Instead, she approached Victoria with the measured steps of someone delivering a final verdict. "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling," Sarah said quietly, "people absolutely go to federal prison for violating civil rights laws and embezzling federal funds. In fact, the average sentence for educational embezzlement is 12 to 15 years. Victoria looked up at Sarah with the hollow expression of someone watching their entire life collapse in real time. 12 to 15 years. Federal sentencing guidelines are quite specific, Sarah continued with clinical precision. Embezzlement of federal education funds carries enhanced penalties because it involves both theft of public money and harm to vulnerable populations. Add in the civil rights violations, and you're looking at consecutive rather than concurrent sentences. Special Agent Morrison entered the lobby with the purposeful stride of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She approached Victoria's chair, her badge clearly visible and her expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Victoria Ashworth Sterling?" Victoria's voice came out as a croak. "Yes. I'm Special Agent Rebecca Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for embezzlement of federal funds, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and wire fraud in connection with the misappropriation of special education resources." The Miranda rights sounded surreal, echoing through the elementary school lobby, bouncing off construction paper decorations and motivational posters about friendship and kindness. Victoria tried to stand as Agent Morrison approached with handcuffs, but her knees buckled again. "The handcuffs are necessary, ma'am," Agent Morrison said, not unkindly. "Standard procedure for federal arrests." The click of metal around Victoria's wrists seemed to echo through the entire building. Victoria Ashworth Sterling, who had walked through these halls for months, feeling like a queen surveying her domain, was now officially a federal prisoner. "Tom!" Victoria called desperately to her attorney as Agent Morrison began to guide her toward the door. "Call Richard. Tell him to liquidate everything. The house, the cars, the investment accounts. We'll need bail money." Thomas Hartwell looked up from his phone with the expression of someone delivering terminal diagnosis. "Victoria, I just spoke with my federal contacts. Bail for this type of case typically runs between $5 and $10 million, and that's if they grant bail at all, which they often don't for flight risks in embezzlement cases. $10 million. Victoria's net worth was substantial, but not that substantial, especially once the civil asset forfeiture proceedings began. The FBI would freeze everything connected to the embezzled funds, which included the BMW, the house renovations, and possibly the house itself, if they could prove it was purchased with tainted money. As Agent Morrison guided Victoria past the reception desk, she found herself face to face with Dr. Patricia Hayes, who had been quietly watching the proceedings from her office doorway. The elderly special education coordinator looked at Victoria with an expression of profound sadness rather than triumph. "Patricia," Victoria whispered, "you don't understand what you've done. The district will be in chaos. The children will suffer." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Victoria, the children have been suffering for 18 months, while you stole money meant for their therapy and education. Today, the suffering stops." Victoria tried to respond, but Agent Morrison was already guiding her toward the exit. Through the glass doors, she could see the growing crowd of news cameras, parents, and community members who had gathered to witness her downfall. The woman who had craved public validation was about to receive the most public humiliation possible. The walk from the lobby to the FBI vehicle felt like a death march. Camera flashes exploded around Victoria like strobes, capturing every moment of her disgrace for the evening news and social media. Parents who had been intimidated by her authority just hours earlier now stood with their phones recording, their faces showing mixtures of satisfaction and disbelief. "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling," shouted a reporter from Channel 7. "Do you have any comment on the charges against you?" Victoria kept her head down, her hands cuffed behind her back, her expensive heels clicking against the asphalt with none of their former authority. Agent Morrison placed her hand on Victoria's head as she guided her into the back seat of the SUV, protecting her from the vehicle's roof in the same gesture performed for countless other white-collar criminals. Sarah Chen Martinez stood in the lobby, watching through the windows as the FBI convoy prepared to depart. Director Walsh approached her with an expression of professional admiration. "Ms. Chen Martinez," Director Walsh said quietly, "in my 30 years with the Department of Education, I've never seen an investigation this comprehensive or this devastating. You've essentially handed us a textbook case of federal education crimes." Sarah nodded, her expression remaining professional despite the personal satisfaction she felt. "The evidence speaks for itself, Director Walsh. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling documented her own crimes through her statements and actions." Agent Chen joined them, carrying boxes of seized financial records. "Ms. Chen Martinez, the forensic accounting team will need to coordinate with your investigation files. The level of detail you've provided will make prosecution much easier." "Of course," Sarah replied. "Everything the trust collected will be made available to federal prosecutors. We want to ensure every charge sticks." Through the windows, they watched as the FBI convoy pulled away from Riverside Elementary, carrying Victoria toward the federal detention center where she would be processed, photographed, and placed in a holding cell to await her arraignment. The woman who had used her position to hurt vulnerable children was now facing decades in federal prison. Dr. Hayes approached the group, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had finally stopped carrying a crushing secret. "Sarah," she said quietly, "may I ask you something?" Sarah turned, her expression softening as she addressed the woman who had found the courage to speak up when it mattered most. "Of course. How did you know?" Dr. Hayes asked. "How did you know to start investigating 18 months ago? What made you suspect?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. "Maya came home from school crying one day. She said the mean lady had visited her classroom and told her teacher that kids like Maya were too expensive to help. When I asked who the mean lady was, Maya described Victoria perfectly. Dr. Hayes's eyes filled with tears. She went into classrooms and said that to teachers multiple times. Maya has an exceptional memory for voices and faces, part of her autism. She recognized Victoria's voice immediately when she heard it at today's meeting. Sarah's expression hardened. That's when I knew this was personal. Victoria wasn't just implementing bad policies, she was specifically targeting autistic children with malice. Director Walsh was taking notes. That gives us intent and specific targeting, which carries enhanced penalties under federal hate crime statutes. Sarah nodded. Maya's testimony will be crucial in the criminal trial. A 7-year-old girl with autism will tell a jury exactly what Victoria said about children like her. It will be devastating. The irony was perfect and terrible. Victoria's cruelty toward Maya would be documented by Maya's own exceptional memory, the very neurological difference that Victoria had mocked and dismissed. The child she had called weird would be the witness whose testimony sent her to prison. Thomas Hartwell, Victoria's attorney, approached the group with the defeated expression of someone realizing his client was completely without defense. Ms. Chen Martinez, he said formally, I represent Mrs. Ashworth Sterling. I'd like to discuss the possibility of a plea agreement. Sarah's smile was arctic. Mr. Hartwell, plea agreements are negotiated with federal prosecutors, not with victims. However, I can tell you that the Chen Trust has no interest in reducing charges or accepting anything less than full prosecution under federal law. Hartwell's shoulders sagged. Ms. Chen Martinez, my client has a family, a daughter who will be affected by this. Surely there's room for some compassion. Your client spent 18 months showing exactly how much compassion she has for other people's children, Sarah replied coldly. She called disabled children resource drains and problems to be solved. She stole money from their therapy accounts to pay for her own daughter's private school. She targeted vulnerable families because she thought they were powerless to fight back. Sarah stepped closer to Hartwell, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Mr. Hartwell, your client made one critical error. She assumed that being a waitress meant I was powerless. She assumed that having an autistic child meant we were weak. She assumed that working-class families would just accept whatever scraps she decided to throw us. Sarah's voice grew harder with each word. She was wrong about all of it, and now she's going to spend the next 20 years in federal prison thinking about exactly how wrong she was. Hartwell opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah had already turned away, dismissing him as completely as Victoria had dismissed the families of disabled children. Outside, the last of the news crews were packing up their equipment. The FBI convoy was gone. The federal investigators were securing evidence and preparing for tomorrow's arraignment. Victoria Ashworth Sterling's reign of terror over vulnerable children was officially over. But for Sarah Chen Martinez, the work was just beginning. Because taking down Victoria was only the first step in a much larger plan to reform the entire system that had allowed her to thrive. The fall had been spectacular. The cleanup would be even more satisfying. The emergency school board meeting was called for 7 p.m. that same evening, in the aftermath of Victoria's arrest. Word had spread through Riverside like wildfire. Social media posts, phone calls, and hastily organized community groups had mobilized parents and teachers who had been silently enduring Victoria's reign for over a year. By 6:45 p.m., the elementary school auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in the hallways and outside the building. Unlike the morning's carefully controlled presentation, this gathering crackled with the electric energy of a community that had finally found its voice. Sarah Chen Martinez arrived 15 minutes early, no longer maintaining any pretense about her identity. She wore the same tailored business suit from the afternoon, carrying her briefcase and walking with the confident stride of someone who owned the room before entering it. The transformation was so complete that several parents who had known her as the tired waitress from Mel's did double takes as she passed. Marcus Thompson, her investigative journalist ally, approached with a satisfied grin. "Sarah, the story goes live in 20 minutes on the paper's website. Front page tomorrow with the headline, 'Undercover Attorney Exposes $1 Million School Discrimination Scheme.'" Sarah nodded approvingly. "Make sure you emphasize the federal penalties. Other school districts need to understand what happens when you target disabled children." Already done. I also got a statement from the State Attorney General's office confirming they're opening a criminal investigation into possible racketeering charges. Racketeering. The word sent a murmur through the crowd of parents who had overheard. Victoria hadn't just committed isolated acts of corruption. She had operated a systematic scheme to defraud disabled children of their federally mandated services. Dr. Patricia Hayes took the podium at exactly 7 p.m., her face showing both exhaustion and relief. As the senior administrator still standing, she had been appointed interim superintendent until the state could install emergency management. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. D. Hayes began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I want to begin by apologizing to every family whose children were harmed by the policies implemented under Mrs. Ashworth Sterling's leadership." The applause was immediate and thunderous, but Dr. Hayes raised her hand for silence. Apologies, however, are not enough. Tonight, I want to announce the immediate restoration of all special education services that were cut or reduced over the past 18 months. Every therapy session, every aid position, every accommodation that was eliminated will be fully reinstated effective tomorrow morning. The auditorium erupted. Parents were crying, hugging each other, cheering. Maria Santos, whose son Miguel had cerebral palsy, stood up with tears streaming down her face. "Dr. Hayes, how is that possible? The budget cuts, the funding issues." Dr. Hayes smiled for the first time in months. "Mrs. Santos, it turns out that when you stop embezzling special education funds and redirecting them to inappropriate uses, there's actually plenty of money to serve our children properly." Agent David Chen, who had remained at the school to oversee the financial investigation, approached the podium with a thick folder of documents. "If I may," Agent Chen announced, "the Federal Department of Education has completed its preliminary financial audit. We've identified approximately $340,000 in misappropriated special education funds over the past 18 months. These funds will be recovered through asset forfeiture and restored to their proper accounts. $340,000. The number hung in the air like an accusation. That was how much money Victoria had stolen from disabled children while publicly claiming the district couldn't afford their services. Sarah stood up in the audience, her movement drawing immediate attention. "Dr. Hayes, Agent Chen, if I may address the community." Dr. Hayes nodded immediately. "Of course, Ms. Chen Martinez. I think everyone would like to hear from you." Sarah walked to the front of the auditorium with measured steps, her heels clicking against the floor in the sudden silence. When she turned to face the crowd, her expression was calm, but her eyes blazed with controlled fury. 18 months ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room, my daughter Maya came home from school crying. She told me that a mean lady had visited her classroom and said that children like Maya were too expensive to help. The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. That night, I made a decision. I decided that Maya, and every other disabled child in this district, deserved better than to be treated like a budget line item to be eliminated. I decided that someone needed to hold Victoria Ashworth Sterling accountable for her cruelty. Sarah paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience of parents, teachers, and community members. So I went undercover. For 18 months I worked at Mel's Diner, served Victoria coffee every morning, and listened to her casual cruelty toward your children. I documented every discriminatory statement, every illegal financial decision, every moment when she chose personal gain over children's welfare. Elena Rodriguez, whose daughter Isabella had autism, raised her hand tentatively. "Ms. Chen Martinez, why didn't you just file a complaint right away? Why wait 18 months? Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because complaints can be dismissed. Investigations can be buried. But federal crimes documented over 18 months with ironclad evidence, those send people to prison for decades." The murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Victoria Ashworth Sterling believed she could target disabled children with impunity because she assumed their families were powerless. She was wrong. Today, she learned that underestimating people based on their circumstances is a very expensive mistake. Sarah opened her briefcase and removed a document that she held up for the crowd to see. "This is a check from the Evelyn Chen Memorial Trust for Disability Advocacy in the amount of $2 million. It will establish a permanent legal fund to ensure that what happened here never happens again in any school district." The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah wasn't finished. "This fund will provide free legal representation to any family whose disabled child is denied appropriate services. It will conduct regular audits of special education spending, and it will investigate any administrator who thinks they can get away with treating disabled children as disposable." Dr. Hayes was crying openly now. "Ms. Chen Martinez, this is incredible. But why? Why dedicate so much time and resources to this fight?" Sarah's expression softened as she thought about Maya, probably at home now working on her homework with the specialized tutor that Sarah had secretly hired. "Because every child deserves dignity. Every child deserves the chance to reach their potential, and every parent deserves to know that when they send their child to school, that child will be treated with respect and compassion." Sarah's voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of someone who had spent her career fighting for justice. Victoria Ashworth Sterling thought disabled children were problems to be solved or expenses to be eliminated. She was wrong. They are human beings with infinite potential who deserve every opportunity to succeed. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Parents who had felt helpless for months were finally seeing justice served. Teachers who had been forced to watch their students suffer were finally seeing hope restored. As the applause died down, Agent Chen returned to the podium with an update from federal investigators. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received word from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling's bail hearing has been set for tomorrow morning. The government will be arguing that she poses a flight risk and should be held without bail pending trial." Marcus Thompson raised his hand from the press section. "Agent Chen, what additional charges might be filed? The investigation is ongoing, but we're exploring conspiracy charges, racketeering under the RICO Act, and civil rights violations under federal hate crime statutes. If convicted on all charges, Mrs. Ashworth Sterling could face up to 40 years in federal prison." 40 years. Victoria Ashworth Sterling, who had strutted through these halls like a petty tyrant, was facing the rest of her life behind bars. Dr. Hayes retook the podium for final announcements. "Before we adjourn, I want to make several commitments to this community. First, the district will undergo a complete financial audit by an independent firm. Second, all special education policies will be reviewed by disability rights advocates. Third, we will establish a parent advisory committee with real authority to prevent future abuse." Sarah nodded approvingly. These were exactly the systemic changes needed to prevent another Victoria from rising to power. "Finally," Dr. Hayes continued, "I want to read a statement from the State Board of Education. Effective immediately, Riverside School District will be used as a model for other districts on how to properly serve disabled students. Our restored programs will be showcased as examples of best practices in inclusive education." The irony was perfect. Victoria had wanted to make Riverside a model district, and she had succeeded, just not in the way she intended. Instead of being a model for budget cuts and discrimination, Riverside would now be a model for justice and inclusion. As the meeting adjourned, parents approached Sarah with tears in their eyes and words of gratitude. Teachers who had been silenced for months finally felt safe to speak up about the changes they wanted to see. Tom Morrison, the truck driver whose son Danny had Down syndrome, clasped Sarah's hand with both of his. "Ms. Chen Martinez, I don't know how to thank you. Danny's been so sad since they cut his speech therapy. Tomorrow he gets to start again." Sarah smiled, and for the first time in 18 months, it was a smile of pure joy rather than strategic planning. "Mr. Morrison, seeing Danny succeed will be all the thanks I need." As the crowd dispersed into the evening air, Sarah stood alone in the auditorium for a moment, surrounded by the children's artwork and motivational posters that Victoria had walked past every day without seeing their meaning. Tomorrow, Victoria Ashworth Sterling would wake up in a federal detention cell facing the destruction of everything she had built. Her house would be seized, her bank accounts would be frozen, her reputation would be destroyed forever. But tonight, 17 disabled children in Riverside would go to sleep, knowing that tomorrow they would receive the services and support they deserved. The cleanup was complete. Justice had been served. And Sarah Chen Martinez could finally go home and tell her daughter Maya that the mean lady would never hurt another child again. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle buzzed with activity as United States versus Victoria Ashworth Sterling reached its climactic conclusion. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, dominated headlines across the Pacific Northwest, and become a landmark case in disability rights law. Every major news outlet had covered the proceedings, dubbing it the coffee shop conspiracy, after details emerged of Sarah's undercover investigation. Sarah Chen Martinez sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing a navy blue suit that projected quiet confidence. Beside her sat Maya, now 8 years old and thriving in her restored therapy programs. Maya's presence wasn't required for today's verdict, but Sarah had wanted her daughter to witness the moment when justice was finally, officially served. "Mommy," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "Is the mean lady going away now?" Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "Yes, sweetheart. The mean lady is going away for a very long time." At the defendant's table, Victoria Ashworth Sterling looked nothing like the imperious school board president who had terrorized disabled children 18 months earlier. Federal detention had stripped away her designer clothes, expensive hairstyles, and commanding presence. She wore a standard orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her hands cuffed behind her back. The transformation from predator to prey was complete. Her legal team, now consisting of overworked public defenders after her assets were frozen, sat beside her with the resigned expressions of attorneys who knew they were fighting an unwinnable case. The evidence against Victoria was overwhelming, documented with the meticulous precision that only an experienced civil rights attorney could provide. Judge Margaret Winters, a Reagan appointee known for her strict interpretation of federal sentencing guidelines, called the court to order at exactly 2 p.m. At 71, she had presided over hundreds of federal criminal trials, but the evidence presented in this case had clearly affected her deeply. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Winters commanded. Victoria struggled to stand with her hands cuffed, her legs shaking visibly. The jury's deliberation had lasted only 4 hours, a remarkably short time that suggested no uncertainty about her guilt. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The jury foreman, a retired teacher named Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, though the coincidence felt cosmically appropriate, stood with a folder containing Victoria's fate. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of embezzlement of federal education funds, how do you find?" "Guilty." The word echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Victoria's knees buckled, and her attorney had to steady her. "On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law, how do you find?" "Guilty." Victoria was sobbing now, the sound carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "On the charge of wire fraud in connection with the misappropriation of special education resources, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of criminal conspiracy under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, how do you find?" "Guilty." 4 federal felonies, each carrying decades in prison. Victoria Ashworth Sterling, who had once believed herself above the law, was now officially a convicted felon, facing the rest of her life behind bars. Judge Winters accepted the verdict with the solemnity the moment deserved. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling, you have been found guilty on all counts by a jury of your peers. Sentencing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Until that time, you will remain in federal custody. As the marshals prepared to escort Victoria from the courtroom, she turned toward the gallery with desperate eyes, searching for something: sympathy, forgiveness, hope. Her gaze found Sarah's calm, impassive face and held it for a long moment. Victoria's lips moved silently, perhaps trying to form an apology or a plea, but Sarah's expression never wavered. There would be no forgiveness for someone who had systematically tormented vulnerable children. There would be no mercy for someone who had stolen from disabled kids to fund her own daughter's privilege. Victoria's final look shifted to Maya, the little girl whose exceptional memory had provided crucial testimony about Victoria's visits to special education classrooms. Maya met Victoria's gaze with the direct, unflinching stare that neurotypical people often found uncomfortable, but which Victoria now recognized as the mark of a child who saw the world exactly as it was. "She's not weird," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying in the silent courtroom. "She's just mean." It was the perfect epitaph for Victoria's career in education. The marshals led Victoria away through a side door that led directly to the federal detention center. She would spend the next 2 weeks in a concrete cell, waiting to learn whether she would die in federal prison or merely spend the next 30 years there. As the courtroom began to empty, Dr. Patricia Hayes approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. At 63, she had officially retired from education, but had testified as a key witness in Victoria's trial. "Sarah," Dr. Hayes said softly, 40 years in education, and I've never seen justice served so completely. Every child Victoria hurt has been vindicated." Sarah nodded, gathering her briefcase with the same methodical precision she had brought to the investigation. "Patricia, justice isn't just about punishment, it's about prevention. The legal precedents we've established here will protect disabled children across the country." And it was true. United States verse. Ashworth Sterling had already been cited in 6 different federal districts as precedent for aggressive prosecution of education discrimination cases. The Department of Education had issued new guidelines requiring annual civil rights audits of special education spending. Congress was considering the Evelyn Chen Memorial Act, which would establish federal oversight of school districts with histories of discrimination. Marcus Thompson, whose investigative reporting had won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the case, approached with his final interview questions. "Sarah, any regrets about the 18 months undercover? Any part of you that wishes you had moved faster?" Sarah considered the question as she watched Maya carefully organizing her coloring books with the precise attention to detail that made her autism a superpower rather than a limitation. "Marcus, if I had filed a complaint after 1 month, Victoria might have received a reprimand or been asked to resign. She would have moved to another district and hurt other children. By waiting, by building an ironclad case, we ensured that she will never have the opportunity to harm another child again. And the other administrators, the ones who enabled her? 3 resigned in disgrace. 2 were terminated. The superintendent took early retirement. The entire power structure that allowed Victoria to thrive has been dismantled and rebuilt with accountability measures." Sarah's smile was cold and satisfied. Comprehensive victory requires comprehensive planning. As they walked toward the courthouse exit, Maya tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mummy, will my school be safe now?" Sarah knelt to Maya's eye level, straightening her daughter's favorite dinosaur shirt. "Yes, sweetheart. Your school is safe. All the children's schools are safe now. Because you stopped the mean lady? Because we stopped the mean lady together. Your good memory helped send her away so she can never hurt children again." Maya nodded with the serious expression of a child who understood that important work had been accomplished. I'm glad my brain is different. It helped catch the bad person. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. This was why she had spent 18 months pouring coffee and enduring condescension. This was why she had sacrificed her comfortable law firm partnership to work in a diner, so that Maya, and every child like Maya, would grow up knowing that being different was a strength, not a weakness. 2 weeks later, Victoria Ashworth Sterling was sentenced to 37 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Her husband had divorced her during the trial and gained full custody of their daughter. Her house had been seized and sold, with the proceeds going to a victim compensation fund for affected families. Her name had become synonymous with educational corruption and disability discrimination. On the same day as Victoria's sentencing, the Evelyn Chen Memorial Trust announced a $50 million endowment to establish disability advocacy programs in schools across the nation. Sarah would serve as the program's director, ensuring that no other Victoria could rise to power unchecked. That evening, Sarah and Maya sat in their new house, purchased with Sarah's legitimate legal earnings, not hidden trust fund money, working on homework at the kitchen table. Maya was practicing her writing, carefully forming letters with the concentration of someone who found the world endlessly fascinating. "Mommy," Maya said without looking up from her paper, "what does fuck around and find out mean?" Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "Maya, where did you hear that phrase?" "Uncle Marcus said it when the mean lady got arrested. He said she fucked around and found out." Sarah made a mental note to have words with Marcus about his language around children, but she couldn't deny the accuracy of his assessment. "Maya, that's grown-up language, but what Uncle Marcus means is that when people make bad choices and hurt others, eventually they face consequences for their actions." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "Like how the mean lady was mean to kids like me, so now she has to live in jail." "Exactly like that." Maya returned to her writing with satisfied focus. On her paper in careful second-grade handwriting she had written, "My name is Maya, and I am not weird. I am special, and my brain helps catch bad people." Sarah smiled as she read her daughter's words. Victoria Ashworth Sterling had thought she could target vulnerable children with impunity. She had learned in the most expensive way possible that some children come with mothers who are willing to spend 18 months, $50 million, and their entire careers to ensure justice is served. Victoria had fucked around with the wrong family, and she had most definitely found out. Outside their kitchen window, the lights of Riverside Elementary glowed in the distance, where children with disabilities now received the services they deserved, where teachers felt safe advocating for their students, and where no administrator would ever again mistake kindness for weakness or assume that working-class parents lacked the power to fight back. Justice, Sarah reflected as she helped Maya with her homework, wasn't just about punishment. Justice was about making sure it never happened again, and in that mission, Sarah Chen Martinez had achieved complete and total victory.